There is a moment when someone can no longer hide behind the words, "I'm fine." Your soulmate may have been asked a simple question recently, something that sounded harmless at first. What is your biggest regret? And for a second, everything changed. They could have talked about a career decision, a missed opportunity, a mistake from years ago, anything that would have been easier to explain. But instead, something about that question touched a place they have been carefully avoiding. Maybe they paused longer than expected. Maybe they looked away. Maybe their voice changed when they finally answered. Because sometimes the regret that hurts the most isn't the mistake itself. It's the person standing on the other side of that mistake. And this is where you come into the story. You may think they stopped thinking about you. You may believe enough time has passed for the connection to become nothing more than a memory. But what if the opposite happened? What if distance didn't erase what they felt, but finally gave them enough silence to understand it? Imagine someone opening an old box they haven't touched in years and suddenly finding one small object that brings an entire chapter of their life rushing back. That's what this question may have done to them. It forced them to remember something they thought they had buried. Maybe they remembered the moment they could have stayed but chose to leave. The conversation they should have had but avoided. The words they felt but never said. And perhaps the hardest thought of all crossed their mind, what if I had done things differently? You might be wondering why one simple question could affect them this deeply. Because some regrets don't disappear with time. They become quieter, deeper, and harder to confess. And when your soulmate was finally asked to name their biggest regret, the answer may have revealed far more about you than they ever intended. And this is where the regret becomes much deeper. Because they may not regret losing you as much as they regret the way they allowed you to leave. There is a difference between missing someone and realizing you were responsible for creating the distance that separated you. Your soulmate may have thought they had more time. They may have assumed you would always be there, always understand, always leave the door slightly open no matter how many times they hesitated. But now they are looking backward, and certain moments may feel completely different from the way they felt back then. The conversation they avoided suddenly feels important. The message they never answered suddenly feels heavy. The moment they chose pride over vulnerability suddenly looks like the moment everything began to change. And perhaps they keep asking themselves a question they don't want anyone else to hear. Why didn't I just tell them how I really felt? That question can stay with someone for a very long time. Because when you still have the person, you can convince yourself there will always be another opportunity. You can postpone the conversation. You can hide behind fear. You can tell yourself that tomorrow will be different. But when the person is no longer standing in the same place, tomorrow becomes a painful reminder of everything that was left unfinished. Imagine standing at a train station, watching the doors close, while suddenly realizing the ticket was already in your hand. You had the opportunity to get on. You simply believed there would be another train. That may be how your soulmate sees the past now. Not as one dramatic mistake, but as a series of small choices that slowly created a distance they never intended to create. Maybe they thought walking away would make things easier. Maybe they believed their feelings would eventually disappear if they stopped looking at them. Maybe they convinced themselves that choosing silence was safer than admitting how deeply the connection affected them. But silence doesn't always erase feelings. Sometimes it gives those feelings room to grow louder. And now they may be recognizing something they were unwilling to admit before. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. You weren't expecting them to know everything. You simply wanted them to stop pretending they felt nothing. You might be wondering, if they regretted this much, why didn't they come back already? Why haven't they reached out? Why would someone miss you and still remain silent? Because regret and courage are not the same thing. Someone can deeply regret a decision and still be terrified of confronting the consequences of that decision. They may be afraid that you have changed. They may be afraid you no longer feel the same. They may be afraid that an apology won't be enough. And perhaps their biggest fear is that you will look at them now and realize you deserved someone who didn't need to lose you before understanding your value. That thought can be difficult to face. So instead of reaching toward you, they may replay the past privately, wondering where everything went wrong. What if I had stayed? What if I had trusted them? What if I had spoken instead of disappearing? Those questions don't necessarily mean they know what they will do next, but they reveal something important about what is happening inside them. The regret is forcing them to see the connection from a completely different perspective. Before, they may have focused on why things couldn't work. Now they may be focusing on what could have happened if fear, pride, timing, or circumstances hadn't gotten in the way. And that shift changes everything. Because once someone starts imagining the version of the story where they made a different choice, the past becomes much harder to leave behind. Think about an old photograph that seemed meaningless for years, until one day you realize it captured the last moment before everything changed. The photograph didn't change. Your understanding of it did. That's what may be happening with their memories of you. The moments they once considered ordinary may now feel strangely precious. Your conversations, your patience, the way you noticed things other people didn't, the way you made them feel understood without demanding that they explain every part of themselves. They may finally be realizing that what they had with you wasn't something they could simply replace by meeting someone new. And this is where their regret becomes personal. They aren't only grieving what happened between you, they are confronting the version of themselves that made the choices that caused it. They may recognize that fear made them distant, pride made them stubborn, confusion made them inconsistent, and silence allowed something meaningful to slip away. The hardest part is that you may have already learned the lesson they are only beginning to understand. You learned that love cannot survive forever on potential. You learned that feelings mean very little when actions refuse to follow them. And perhaps you finally stopped waiting for them to become ready. That may be what hurts them most. Because they can regret the past, but they cannot control what you choose now. They may wish they could return to that moment and say what they should have said. They may wish they could reach through time and change one decision. But time doesn't work that way. You don't get to rewrite the moment. You only get to decide what you do after finally understanding it. And somewhere inside your soulmate, that understanding may be growing stronger every day. The regret isn't simply that you left. It's that when you were still there, they didn't realize how much your presence meant. And now they are beginning to understand that losing someone is not always the moment they walk away. Sometimes you lose them much earlier, in all the moments when you had the chance to choose them and didn't. There is one memory your soulmate may have tried to bury, but after answering that question, it suddenly became impossible to ignore. It wasn't necessarily the biggest moment between you. It may have been something incredibly small, something you probably never realized would stay with them. A look across the room. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. The way you laughed at something they said. The way you understood their silence without forcing them to explain it. Sometimes the memories that return during regret aren't the dramatic ones. They are the ordinary moments that suddenly become priceless when you realize they cannot be recreated in exactly the same way. And that may be what happened after they were asked about their biggest regret. They answered the question, but their mind may have immediately traveled somewhere else, back to you, back to a version of their life where the two of you were still connected and the future had not yet taken a different direction. Imagine finding an old photograph tucked inside a drawer. You haven't looked at it for years, and at first it seems like nothing more than an old picture. But then you notice the faces, the place, the expression in someone's eyes, and suddenly an entire chapter comes rushing back. The photograph didn't become more important. You simply became old enough, distant enough, and aware enough to understand what it meant. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar with their memories of you. A moment they once dismissed as ordinary may now feel like something they would give almost anything to experience again. And perhaps this is why their regret has become so difficult to explain. They aren't only remembering you, they are remembering how they felt when you were there. That distinction matters, because someone can miss a person and still move forward, but when they begin missing the version of themselves they were around that person, the feeling becomes much harder to escape. Maybe you made them feel seen in a way they weren't accustomed to. Maybe you noticed the things they tried to hide. Maybe they could be vulnerable around you without realizing how rare that feeling was. At the time, they may have taken it for granted. They may have assumed that connection would always be available whenever they were finally ready to appreciate it. But now, when they compare that feeling with what exists in their life today, the difference may be becoming impossible to ignore. You might be wondering, why would they suddenly remember all these little things now? Because regret has a strange way of changing the meaning of the past. When something is present, we often notice what is inconvenient about it. When it is gone, we sometimes notice what was irreplaceable. They may remember the difficult conversations, the misunderstandings, and the moments that pushed you apart. But now those memories may be sitting beside another realization. There were also moments when you were trying. You were showing up. You were giving them chances. You were offering something real while they were still trying to understand what they wanted. And perhaps the most painful memory is the moment they realized you stopped trying. Not because your feelings suddenly disappeared, but because you finally understood that you couldn't carry the entire connection alone. That realization may be replaying in their mind now. When did they stop waiting for me? When did they finally let go? Did I realize it too late? Those questions can become louder than the original regret itself. Think about a song you haven't heard in years. You can go months, even years, without thinking about it, and then one unexpected note plays somewhere, and suddenly you're transported back to a person, a place, a feeling, an entire period of your life. That's how memory works in moments of emotional vulnerability. One sound, one phrase, one familiar place, one question can unlock something that was never truly gone. And your soulmate may have discovered that their connection with you was not as forgotten as they wanted to believe. They may have tried to move forward by keeping busy, meeting new people, changing routines, or convincing themselves that everything happened for a reason. But when the right memory appears, the emotional truth can become much harder to avoid. They may not be thinking about you every second of every day, but there may be certain moments when your memory arrives with an intensity they cannot explain. And what makes it more complicated is that they may now understand something they couldn't understand before. They weren't simply missing a relationship. They were missing a feeling. The feeling of being understood. The feeling of being known. The feeling that someone could look past their surface and still choose to stay. And perhaps that is why the question about their biggest regret hit so deeply. It didn't just ask them to remember a mistake. It forced them to remember what that mistake cost them. You may have wondered whether they ever think about the little things you shared, whether they remember conversations you assumed meant nothing, whether they ever replay moments that you have already released. The truth is, memories don't require permission to return. Sometimes they appear when the mind finally becomes quiet enough to hear what the heart has been avoiding. And if their answer brought you back into their thoughts, then something inside them may have shifted. They may now be looking at the past differently, not with the certainty they once had, but with questions. Questions about timing. Questions about choices. Questions about whether the connection could have become something more if they had been brave enough to handle it differently. But there is one realization that can make all of these memories even more painful. It is the moment they begin to wonder whether you still remember them at all. Because regret is one thing when you believe the door is still open. Regret becomes something entirely different when you realize the person you lost may have already learned how to live without you. And that may be the thought they are struggling with now. Not simply, I miss them, but something much more frightening. What if they no longer miss me? And this is where everything becomes even more emotional, because your soulmate may finally be realizing that what they lost wasn't simply a relationship, a conversation, or a person from their past. They lost an experience they didn't fully understand while they were living it. They may have spent a long time telling themselves that the connection had its problems, that the timing was wrong, that too many things stood between you, or that walking away was simply the practical choice. But now their perspective may be changing. They are beginning to understand that sometimes the most meaningful connections are not recognized by how easy they are, but by how deeply they continue to affect you long after they are gone. And perhaps that is what makes their regrets so difficult to carry. They can move forward with their life, meet new people, create new memories, and convince themselves that everything is fine. But somewhere beneath all of that, there may still be a quiet comparison happening. Not necessarily a conscious comparison every day, but those little moments when someone says something and it reminds them of you. When someone looks at them but doesn't quite understand them the way you did. When a conversation feels empty because they remember what genuine emotional depth felt like. Imagine walking into a house you've lived in for years and suddenly discovering a room you had forgotten existed. The room was always there. You simply never understood its value until you needed somewhere to go. That may be how they are beginning to view the connection with you. They didn't necessarily realize how much emotional space you occupied until life continued without you. And now they may be asking themselves a question that becomes harder to silence with every passing day. Did I walk away from the person I actually wanted? That question changes the entire meaning of their regret. Because regret isn't always about wanting the past back exactly as it was. Sometimes it's about realizing that your choices created a future you never actually wanted. They may now see that fear influenced their decisions more than love did. Pride may have spoken louder than vulnerability. Silence may have protected them from an uncomfortable conversation, but it also protected them from discovering what could have happened if they had simply been honest. And perhaps they are finally admitting something they never wanted to admit. You were not asking them for perfection. You were asking them to meet you emotionally. You were asking them to be honest about what was happening between you. You were asking them to stop running from something that mattered. And maybe they weren't ready then. Maybe they thought they would become ready later. But later has a way of becoming now, and now has a way of exposing everything we postponed. You might be wondering, if they finally understand my value, does that mean they are going to come back? Not necessarily. And that uncertainty is important. Real regret doesn't always immediately become action. Sometimes it first becomes reflection. Sometimes a person has to sit with the consequences of their own decisions before they can even imagine approaching the person they hurt or lost. They may be wondering whether you would forgive them, whether you would listen, or whether you would simply look at them and say, "You had your chance." That possibility may be frightening them more than you realize, because there is a difference between missing someone who is still waiting and missing someone who has genuinely moved forward. If they believe you have changed, grown, or emotionally detached, then their regret becomes much heavier. They can no longer assume that the old version of you is standing exactly where they left you. Imagine returning to a place you once called home and discovering that everything has been renovated. The street is familiar, the location is familiar, but the door is different, the rooms are different, and you are no longer sure you have the right to walk inside. That may be how they feel about you now. They remember who you were, but they may sense that you are no longer the same person. And perhaps that is what makes them hesitate. They may be realizing that while they were trying to understand their own feelings, you were learning how to live without their uncertainty. You were learning that love should not require you to constantly question where you stand. You were learning that someone can have feelings for you and still fail to give you what you deserve. And that lesson may have changed you. This is why their regret can become almost like a mirror. When they look back at what happened, they aren't only seeing you, they are seeing themselves. They see the moments they were distant, They see the times they could have communicated better. They see the chances they allowed to pass. They see the version of themselves that believed there would always be more time. And perhaps the most painful realization is that they now understand something they couldn't understand when you were together. Your presence wasn't guaranteed. You were choosing them too, until you reached the point where choosing yourself became necessary. That is a very different kind of loss. They may have believed that you would always remain emotionally available because of the connection you shared. But eventually, you had to protect your own heart. And now they may be confronting the consequences of that reality. Maybe they don't regret meeting you. Maybe they don't even regret the entire relationship. Maybe their biggest regret is much more specific, that they had something real in front of them and didn't have the courage, maturity, or clarity to recognize it while they still had access to it. And once someone reaches that realization, the past doesn't look the same anymore. The memories become sharper. The silence becomes louder. The unanswered questions become harder to ignore. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, they may finally be understanding what they actually lost. Not just you, but the possibility of who the two of you could have become together. And now we reach the part they may be struggling with the most, because regret eventually asks a person to make a choice. They can keep looking backward, replaying the same memories, wondering what might have happened, or they can finally admit what those memories have been trying to tell them. Your soulmate may not have expected one simple question about their biggest regret to bring you back into their mind this strongly. They may have thought the past was safely behind them. But now, they may be realizing that some chapters don't close simply because we stop talking about them. Sometimes a chapter remains open inside us because there is something we never had the courage to say. And perhaps their biggest regret has brought them directly to that unfinished sentence. Maybe they are asking themselves, what if I had one more chance? Maybe they wonder whether you would even recognize the person they have become. Maybe they wonder if you would believe an apology after everything that happened. And perhaps the question that scares them most is much simpler. What if they have finally moved on? Because regret feels very different when you believe someone is still waiting for you compared with when you realize they may have built an entire life without expecting you to return. Imagine standing outside a door you once walked through freely, only to discover that you no longer know whether you are welcome inside. The door may not be locked, but you cannot simply assume it will open because it opened before. That is the position your soulmate may be finding themselves in now. They may remember the closeness you once shared, but they also understand that time has changed both of you. You have experienced things they weren't there to witness. You have grown in ways they may not fully understand. You may have healed parts of yourself that once desperately wanted answers from them, and that realization can create a very different kind of fear. They may no longer be wondering only whether they miss you. They may be wondering whether they still have a place in your world. This is where regret becomes more than an emotion. It becomes a confrontation with reality. They have to accept that loving someone in their mind is not the same as showing up for them in real life. Remembering you is not the same as choosing you. Feeling sorry is not the same as taking responsibility. And if they ever decide to approach you again, they may understand that words alone won't erase the past. They would have to come with honesty. They would have to acknowledge what happened instead of pretending nothing mattered. They would have to face the possibility that you might not respond the way they imagine. And perhaps that is why they have remained quiet for so long. Silence can sometimes be easier than vulnerability because silence protects the ego. A confession doesn't. Imagine holding a letter for years, knowing exactly what you want to say, but never sending it because once it leaves your hands, you no longer control what happens next. That may be what their heart feels like right now. They may have words they wish they could give you, explanations they wish they had offered earlier, and feelings they never knew how to express when it actually mattered. But the longer they wait, the more difficult those words become. And perhaps somewhere deep inside, they know that if they ever speak, they cannot simply say, "I miss you." They may need to say, "I understand now. I understand why you walked away. I understand why you stopped waiting. I understand what my choices cost us. Understand that I had something meaningful and didn't treat it with the care it deserved. That kind of honesty requires more than emotion. It requires humility. And maybe that is the transformation taking place inside them now. They aren't simply remembering you. They are finally understanding the role they played in losing you. You might be asking yourself, does their regret mean we are destined to reunite? The truth is, no one can promise that. A powerful connection does not erase free will, timing, or the choices two people make. But what this regret can reveal is that the story may not feel emotionally finished for them. Something has been stirred, something they thought they had buried has resurfaced. And sometimes that is the beginning of a completely different kind of chapter, whether that chapter leads to reconnection, closure, an apology, or simply a deeper understanding of what happened. The important part is that you don't have to chase the answer. You don't have to force them to admit what they feel. You don't have to become smaller just to make room for someone who once failed to recognize your value. If they truly regret what happened, then their actions will eventually have to speak louder than their memories. And this is where your power comes back to you. Their regret belongs to them. Their realization belongs to them. Their next decision belongs to them. Your responsibility is not to sit frozen in the past, waiting for someone else to become ready. Your responsibility is to keep becoming the person you were meant to become. Because maybe the most unexpected part of this entire story is that you were never supposed to remain the same person they walked away from. Perhaps while they were remembering you, you were becoming someone they could no longer take for granted. And if they ever do return, they won't simply be meeting the person they left behind. They will be meeting the person who survived the unanswered questions, released the need for validation, and learned that love should never require constant uncertainty. So maybe their biggest regret wasn't simply losing you. Maybe it was believing they would always have another opportunity to tell you what they should have said when you were still standing there. And now the question isn't whether they remember you. The question is whether they will finally have the courage to do something about what they now understand. Because sometimes the person who regrets losing you doesn't realize your value when you leave. They realize it when life becomes quiet enough for them to hear the truth they were avoiding all along. They didn't lose someone ordinary. They lost someone who genuinely mattered to them, and no amount of pretending can make that realization disappear.